So I just want to thank everybody for coming today. I think this is going to be a really important educational experience for a lot of us. I work on a website myself, so I'm really eager to hear how to avoid getting duped by a fake image or fake video. I'm Kathy Kiley. I'm the National Press Club Journalism Institute's Press Freedom Fellow, and I'm really happy to have this panel here because the Press Club Journalism Institute provides professional training. We are the nonprofit wing of the National Press Club, so yes, your tax-deductible contributions are accepted. And we provide both professional training for journalists as well as we do work on press freedom both in the United States and worldwide. And I think this panel really fits under both of those rubrics because freedom of the press depends on credibility of the press. So avoiding fake news and being duped is really important, and I think that's what we're going to learn about. And that obviously is part of professional training for journalists in a digital world. So without further ado, I'd like to thank Ms. Mickey Osterreicher for bringing this panel and the experts from the National Press Photographers Association here to the Press Club today, and he will moderate the session. So thanks a lot, Mickey.
Thank you. So thanks, all of you, for coming. I want to thank the Press Club and the Journalism Institute, especially Kathy Kiley and Krista White and Julie Hsu, and with special thanks to Sinclair Broadcast Group for their financial support of this event. So we'll just do the introduction of the panelists and then get right to it. We'll start with Margaret Sullivan, who's next to me. Margaret is the Washington Post's media columnist. She's the first woman and longest-serving public editor of the New York Times. And prior to that, she was the editor and vice president of the Buffalo News, which is where we got to know each other. Next to her is Bill Anderson. Bill is the director of news content and operations for Sinclair Broadcast Group. Prior to joining Sinclair, he worked as a photographer, reporter, producer, and is an Emmy Award-winning news director. He's a 30-year veteran of television broadcasting and is a proud graduate of the University of Missouri School of Journalism. Next to him is another good friend, Santiago Lyon, who was the director of photography for the Associated Press from 2003 to 2016. And where did I go? After a 20-year career as a photographer, during which he won multiple awards for his work covering conflict, a former Nieman Fellow at Harvard and a Sulzberger Fellow at Columbia University, he joined the AP in 1991. After working for UPI and Reuters, under his direction, the AP earned 3 of its 31 Pulitzer Prizes for photography. He currently works with the World Press Photo Foundation in the U.S. and teaches at the ICP in New York. And next to him is Sam Stewart. Sam is a journalist and a media technologist who's researched verification at Stanford University and as a grantee of the Knight Fellow. He frequently trains newsrooms on verification tools and techniques and also assists countering misinformation efforts with the U.S. State Department and NATO partners. And if I could just have kept up with all of that, you'd have their stuff up there. So we'll just start with a real recent image, just kind of get everybody's eyes open. If the panel can see it, hopefully. So this is an image that was just up last week of a gentleman mowing his lawn with a tornado in the background. And, you know, the question is, wow, that's some picture. Is it real? And some people obviously thought the same thing. Snopes did a little investigation, and it turns out, yes, it is real. But one of the things that they coined in that, and it's a term that's been around for a while, is photography. And that's one of the things we'd really like to avoid, especially in news photography. Certainly, this is a picture which was being circulated a lot after Hurricane Sandy And, you know, it's just as an amazing picture, if only it were real, of a scuba diver going through Times Square subway. So with that, you know, one of the things we deal with at the NPPA is a code of ethics. It's a very strong one. And this is just the preamble. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but photojournalists operate as trustees of the public. Our primary role is to report visually on significant events and the varied viewpoints in our common world. Our primary goal is the faithful and comprehensive depiction of the subject at hand. As photojournalists, we have the responsibility to document society and to preserve its history through images. Photographic and video images can reveal great truths, expose wrongdoing and neglect, inspire hope and understanding, and connect people around the globe through the language of visual understanding. But photographs can also cause great harm if they are callously intrusive and are manipulated. And I guess that's one of the things that we're really going to touch on today in terms of photo manipulation. And I just want to I'll go down the panel and just get a sense of, since we're talking about fake news, Margaret, what do you think of when you think of fake news?
Well, I mean, it's something that I'm very, very troubled by. I actually have stopped, we can certainly use that term, but I've stopped using it because I think the term itself has become so weaponized. And so, you know, anything that someone like the president doesn't like is fake news. Any news organization that is depicting him in something other than a favorable way, that's fake media. So I think that it's very troubling. But at its heart, fake news is something that is false but presents itself as looking like legitimate news coverage. And it's pretty darn worrisome.
Bill?
I would agree with what Margaret said. It's very worrisome. And I mean, I'll borrow a quote from a CBS producer who was asked about the phrase back in February or March, and he said, it's something that's provably false and has made its way to millions of people. And I think that really summarizes it. I mean, there are always going to be small little tales that are going to be told that don't really go very far. But when things reach a very large audience and they start to change the narrative and they're provably false, that's where we should be doubly concerned.
Santi?
I see the term fake news making its way into regular conversation, where somebody will say something on social media, I went to dinner last night with a friend, and somebody else will say, no, fake news. And so it's become part of the vernacular in some ways. But just to give you an idea of how pervasive the thought of fake news, I think, has become, when I arrived here 15, 20 minutes ago, I went upstairs to get a cup of coffee, and the fellow who gave me the coffee said, I said I was on a panel. He said, what's the panel about? And I said, it's about whether or not you can believe pictures. And he immediately said, no, you can't. Photomontage. And so I grabbed my cup of coffee and came down here.
Sam?
Well, yeah, so, I mean, just echoing what everyone said, I worry, as Santi mentioned, that, it's becoming part of the vernacular, that people are using it to just throw aside opinions that they don't agree with. But I, along with Margaret, don't really like the term. I almost feel like the term is an oxymoron, if you will. The idea that, there's more nuance to a term like fake news, where it's really misinformation or manipulated information or misrepresented information. I think making sure we don't group it as one giant cluster word like that helps us when we actually try to counter those efforts.
So, this picture's been sitting there for a while, and it's certainly nothing new. And I'll just throw up some examples. This was one of O.J. Simpson that was on the cover of both Time and Newsweek, where this was his mugshot, where there was a question about, did one of the news organizations maybe manipulate the coloration, the saturation a bit more than the other? This was one that the New York Times had to deal with in terms of rockets that were being launched in Gaza, that there were certainly this was a photoshopped image The photographer, I believe Santi lost his job over this
No,
one.
I think this one came out of Iran, I believe.
Iran? Okay.
This was a photograph that was released by the Iranian government, and a couple of news organizations picked it up. Turns out they had added some missiles to make it look more impressive, but then there was another unaltered version that also made its way out, so there were two versions floating around simultaneously.
So, adding elements. It's always nice if you get the ball in the shot, but adding it in because you didn't, that's a real problem. And it's something that's been out there for a while. But obviously, I mean, taking things out of a shot, if you look under number 19, you can see somebody's feet in the lower image, and the photographer in this case thought it would look much better to get rid of those feet. But again, that's not necessarily now a truthful image. One of the things in the law is this a true and accurate depiction of the event at the time that the image was taken? And clearly, the top one, the answer would be no. But I think last one, and this one is actually a Washington Post photographer from a few years ago, who had gotten this great image that won an award. The problem was he did a little too much dodging and burning, and took out the background, and again, another photographer who lost a job over that, because we want the images to be truthful. So before we get into all of that, Santiago and I dealt with this a number of years ago during the Obama administration. It dealt with mostly meaningful visual access to the president. And one of the problems was that there were many events that were closed press, and then the president's photographer, which, the president has every right to have a photographer, and they have for many, many years, but they're usually documenting the presidency. We were finding that those images were being pushed out there more and more. So this was President Obama meeting with the Dalai Lama, but so now here we are today. This was, I believe, during the transition period when the president met with Prime Minister Abe. Again, these were pictures where the press wasn't allowed and were taken and then pushed out through the Japanese government. But so we're now up to today, and this is where I really like to talk about this. This was a few weeks ago where the president had a meeting with two Russian officials, and the Russian photographer was there acting as an official government photographer, and also then it was released through TASS. Sam, I'll work backwards. We'll start down the line. I know this isn't necessarily your area of expertise, but clearly, if you're not in the room, if you're not in the place to take the picture, what kind of mischief can there be about what kind of images come out of there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I like that you showed a couple examples of manipulations, we'll call them, that have occurred over time, because I want to remind everybody that this is not something new, right? We've been seeing this for ages. The idea that there are ways, back in the film days, they did it in the darkroom. But even before that, you could have instances that are similar to this, which is the idea that something that may be staged for the camera, let's say. They could have had a very tense meeting that we have no photographs of, and then everyone gets up and shakes hands, and there's a picture taken, and it's not really representative of what actually occurred, right? And so, it's very troubling to me, the idea that there is ongoing restricted access for photographers to be at events, because what you then get, some people in the media call it, propaganda almost, government propaganda, the idea that free and fair reporting of a newsworthy event isn't occurring, I think is very troubling.
And Santiago, one would almost think we choreographed that, because during these meetings about dealing with handout images, Santiago stood up and said, they're not handouts, they're propaganda. So talk about that.
Yeah, it's funny. Propaganda is a term. It's a term that carries a lot of baggage, because when people hear the term propaganda, they immediately think of despots or Nazis or the axis of evil or something very sinister. Propaganda really only means something that's released to propagate an idea. in its origin. And so what you see is effectively propaganda every time independent access is curtailed and the people who are organizing meetings are releasing pictures. They're releasing pictures to propagate a version of events. And we saw that, curiously enough, with the Obama administration to a degree that we had really not seen before. Numerous events were closed to the press and official photographs were released, and the quality of those images was very high, and they were very effective images, to be sure, but they invariably cast the president and his activities in a very rosy light. And so what they were doing was propagating the idea that all is well. They were controlling the narrative. There was no independent access. That happened throughout the Obama administration in both terms. Thanks to some pressure, we were able to put on them, things began to improve a little bit, but the bar had effectively been set quite low. And as a result of that, many actors and many organizations around the world take their cue from what the White House does. And so when access was curtailed in that manner, local governments, local police forces, other country governments also thought that it was all right to curtail the access. And as a result, what we saw around the world was a lessening of access because the example had been set by the Obama administration, which was kind of curious given that President Obama campaigned on a ticket of change and open access and freedom of press and all of that. So that's sort of where it was left, and now with this current administration, we're seeing a little bit more access, curiously enough, but we're also seeing a lot of official pictures being released, and they're typically, from what we can tell, shot by staffers or by people close to the president who are not professional photographers. They're just sort of iPhone pictures that, for the most part, aren't very interesting or very good. So we're sort of this weird journey that we're on in terms of access and what's being released.
So, Bill, on the more local level, can you talk about what you're faced with in terms of access? And has that been a problem?
Well, in terms of access to the powers that be, typically governors, U.S. House members, members of the Senate, mayors, we're seeing, I think, less access. There's a general disdain amongst certain quarters for the profession, and it gives governors and executive leaders and communities sort of license to say, well, I'm not going to let the media in because they're going to distort the story, and then their followers sort of go along with some of this narrative. And I think that's, when I think about when I was a photojournalist from 1986 to 1996 covering stories in different communities, we had an extraordinary amount of access. I mean, we would get inside sometimes of vehicles with governors when they were traveling from one location to another. Maybe not with the camera rolling, but just to be able to take some notes. I remember being out on the campaign trail in Tennessee with some candidates who were running for governor and getting inside. You were way inside the circles, and then the handlers have slowly kind of moved us out. So I think we're getting less and less access. We're getting more and more spin, and we're getting less and less, opportunity to really get the story.
So, Margaret, you've kind of got a broader perspective on this, and I would love to hear that.
Well, I mean, it is interesting to think about, what our complaints were with the Obama administration, which, as Santi said, the idea was, and he said before he was elected, or just as he was elected, that his would be the most transparent administration ever, and we know that it was not in many ways. But I think we're now into, now we can feel nostalgic about that. I think it has been a progression and not in a good direction, and it concerns me certainly. I think the whole way that the press is being talked about, treated, and the way it is very worrisome, very troubling. And the fact that the president, speaks this way about the press seems to, I think pretty clearly gives license to other people at other levels of government to disdain and in some cases, abuse members of the press. And so we saw this in Montana when the Guardian reporter was assaulted. We've seen it with reporters getting detained or arrested for asking questions. And I think that is all related to this depiction of the press as the enemy of the people and fake news and all of that. So it's more than just words. It actually does have the effect of allowing and condoning some very anti-press activities. And somehow we have to get the message out to people that this isn't just about, you know, the snowflakes who are the members of the press, but it's actually about how the public is represented. And I think that's, and I know you feel this way, Mickey, that that's the only answer to this is to some, and I worry about whether this can be done, but I think it's the only answer is to get the members of the public to understand that it's actually their rights that are being impinged on, not just ours.
Yeah, but I guess that's the real question is, and if anybody's got some constructive answers as to how we do that, I think, unfortunately, that the press these days is held in great contempt by a good portion of the public. And almost any complaining about access is just seen as this whining of this petulant child that has always gotten his or her way. So I totally agree, obviously, that we are there as surrogates of the public and acting, at least as photographers, as their eyes and ears. And they can't be in every room, in every place, in every meeting, and to be able to inform the public both with words and visuals. But I think we were seeing, like after Watergate, everybody wanted to be a journalist. Now, I think the pendulum has swung almost the other way. And how do we get it back? How do we get it back to center?
Well, I think there are two things that come to mind for me. One is when it comes to images, we're sort of drowning in images nowadays. They're very ubiquitous. They're everywhere, and it's a mix of professionally produced images and individually produced images. And as those two flows of images meet primarily on social media, it's very confusing and complicated, even for professionals to understand what's going on. So I think part of the issue is that for a certain segment of the population, people are seeing the images, but they have a very limited understanding of where they come from, what the process was, who is selecting the images. And I think it's important that we recognize that photography is a language. It's a visual language, but it's a language nonetheless. And in the same way that we can insert adverbs and adjectives and qualifiers into the written language, that also happens in photography. And I think one of the concerns that I have around the way photography is currently being consumed, beyond the sheer volume of it, is the speed with which it's being consumed and the devices on which it's being consumed. So you have increasingly people consuming media on smartphones or tablets that are very small screens that don't allow for a lot of interpretation unless one takes the time to sort of enlarge the image on the screen. But then the other thing you see is that people are swiping images at a tremendous rate. I mean, it's, if you can get somebody to look at an image for more than 3 seconds, you've won. And it used to be that people would spend more time with images and read images and sort of take in the nuance of images. I worry that that is disappearing as people swipe and move on, very rapidly. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed. How does one address that? Problem identification is easy, as we know. How does one address that? I think that within the context of media literacy, we must not forget the visual mediums as well. We have to figure out ways to educate people at every opportunity about visual literacy, whether that's in the school, whether that's in the community college, whether that's in the university, whether that's, online in other ways. I think it's hugely important.
So I also believe that we're seeing a devaluation of images and in itself professional photography. But on the other hand, I mean, the one thing that I constantly notice, and maybe Bill, you can talk about this, is when I grew up watching, the CBS Evening News, I mean, television were moving images, and the newspaper, where I work, were still images, and never the twain shall meet. And yet now, almost if you watch and pay attention on let's say nightly news, they will use far many more still images than moving images, only because some of those still images are so compelling in nature, and as Santi said, forces you to actually look at the image rather than the visuals going by. So, what are you getting a sense in terms of broadcast journalism? I mean, obviously everything's blending with online, and everybody has the ability to do both.
Yeah, I mean, if you think back probably 30 years ago, we controlled in an evening newscast 100% or 90% of the visual images that we were putting on the air. Our photojournalists shot them. We knew what the material was. We put it on. Once you get into the era of user-generated content, whether it be still photos or chunks of video that are being sent in, you get into this vetting process that you have to, and so I think one of the biggest things, and we talked about this the other day, was that's helped us to try to get better in the vetting process is we've raised our standards on the legal vetting, whether we can actually legally use a photograph, whether we have the copyright permission to use it, or whether or not we can make an argument under the very murky laws and rules of fair use to use it. And what's happened is, in taking photographs and looking at them and trying to figure out whether or not we have an actual position where we can use the photograph or the piece of video, that has raised our standards in terms of vetting the material. And on the separate track that's very separate from that, the fake news track, by increasing our standards on the legal side, it's helped us on the fake news side, because by going through and trying to do the background checking on the photograph to figure out if we can get rights to it, by calling the author of the photograph, by talking to the author of the photograph, by seeking out when the photograph was posted and who actually took the photograph, we've started to figure out oftentimes that the photograph really wasn't the photograph that we thought it was. And so by raising our legal standards, we've been able to raise our vetting of fake news. This was not the case 30 years ago. 30 years ago, we weren't using user-generated content with any great frequency. So we had control over everything. When you no longer have the domain over it, the standard goes up, both on a legal side and on an honesty side. So,
Sam, you talked a little bit about this before we started. I think there's two sides of the coin here. One, what the media does and what their literacy level is. But talk about, visual literacy in terms of the consumer.
Yeah. Well, echoing what Santi said, I think, the real issue that I am worried about is not only, can the media verify these images and put them out there, but one thing that I had noted, and it's kind of disconcerting, is there an ability and a want from people who are amplifying these images over across social media to care that the images are true or not true. I've seen sometimes a concern that people who actually amplify these images and then later are told that these images are not real or they're fake actually aren't concerned about that. They actually are really about the draw of having more followers, having more likes, having the image out there, that there isn't this concern about correcting the record that there is obviously on the journalism side. And so, in tandem with the media, I'll say the professional literacy about verifying this, and it's great to hear Bill say, the legal push has helped delve deeper into the verification push. In tandem with the journalist understanding how to help verify these images, I think there's a huge issue on does the audience know how to do kind of similar verification to make sure what they're looking at is real? And at the end of the day, do they care? Do all of them care that the image isn't real, that they're actually putting forth, maybe some people are sharing that photo of a scuba diver was it Times Square, wherever it was, in the subway, because they think it's neat. And they don't actually have a concern that it's not real, right?
It might not be even a question they're asking.
It might not be a question they're asking, right? And so that's something that I am concerned about. I think, in the commodification of photography across social, I think, as Santi was mentioning, people are flicking by these things in seconds. There may be this concern that there isn't such an issue anymore with things being real or not real. And so that's something that worries me.
Can I just jump in here?
Sure.
I would also add that it's very easy, and I've done it once myself, to share an image that is false. I retweeted something on Twitter that turned out to be, I thought it was presented as one of the marches, one of the protest marches, and it was actually, people flowing through the streets of Venezuela in 2008 or something like that. I don't know. It looked like a mass of people. It was really, it was a little piece of video, I think. And, I was caught up in it too. I did, I did correct myself and unretweeted it and said I had shared it falsely. But it's very easy to share things. Even I'm about as attuned to this as anybody, and I did it. And people can do it unwittingly, but also they can do it just because they don't particularly care whether it's fake or not. Is it cool? Is it interesting?
So I definitely want to move on to the fake images, but before we do, and while we have this image up there, I just want to have one last discussion. How does the media, in some way, or even should they be the gatekeepers? Because one of the problems I think we faced when we were dealing with the Obama administration, and now that we're dealing with this administration, is if they're pushing these images out there that are propaganda, unfortunately, we're seeing the media actually disseminate them as well, as we did here. Now, I think in these images, the discussion really was the fact that the American media was not allowed in. And so it was almost like a fair use type of argument of we're commenting on the picture, rather than the picture just illustrating the story. But how do we get that sense of, and I'd like to just do this down the line, if you know whether, maybe more as the public editor, past public editor at the Times, how do those decisions get made as to whether or not we use the handout photo, we use the propaganda photo? Certainly a reporter an editor wouldn't allow a handout press release to be published verbatim without somebody doing something.
Yeah, well, I think the standard with this has to be transparency. So if we're going to use a handout picture, or one that's beyond handout, in this case, is actually, Russian government propaganda, we have to tell the public in some way what this is. So whether that's in a cut line or in a story or something, we can't just present it as, oh, well, this is just like any other picture with a photo credit. We have to go beyond that.
But do you think that there's any futility
Yes.
in
I think it's
just
futile.
refusing to just
Oh.
to just actually say, you know what, we're not using this picture?
I mean, I don't know if we have that. I mean, in this case, the newsworthiness of that meeting was such that I think that overcame the hesitation about using the images. So you're kind of stuck. You do want to show, once you've have reasonable authentication or verification that this is an actual photo, this took place, and you want to be talking about this meeting in which, if I'm remembering correctly, this was where the President of the United States was sharing classified information with an adversary. You want to be able to depict that, and so I think it's asking too much to say to the mass media, well, don't use that picture. They're going to use it, but they ought to use it with some caveat. And I think it did happen, as you say, it did happen in this case that a pretty reasonable number of outlets actually described what this photo was and may have said something about how the American media was excluded. So I think it actually was handled okay.
Bill, what kind of angst do your news departments go through with these kinds of images?
I'd say, I would echo what Margaret just said, that this is very, very troubling because of the lack of access. And then you also have, the importance and the gravity of the situation, the gravity of the meeting, and then all the things that came out. I think we were actually reporting on the photograph, I think, before we actually knew about what the conversation was. So
That's right.
the photograph, I think, preceded that. So I agree on transparency. I think the other thing that we have to do in order to maintain our reputations is consistency. So we have to call out photographs that are propaganda on a consistent basis. If a photograph is a news release from the campaign, we've got to call that out on a consistent basis. We can't selectively say, well, we're going to call it out on this side and not on the other side. And I think that the Obama administration got called out for it. The Trump administration's been called out for it. And that's part of our job, is just to continue on that consistency and not to be selective in that.
Santiago, what kind of discussions, went on about using handout propaganda images or not?
Well, at the AP, the policy was pretty clear, which was where there was a reasonable expectation of access and a handout image was offered instead of access, it would be refused. Where there wasn't a reasonable expectation of access, then it would be gauged based on its news value. So, for example, the now famous photograph of Obama and some of his cabinet members and other people watching the Osama bin Laden raid go down, which was an official photograph, it was deemed that there was no expectation of access to that particular part of the White House because it was secure, and the momentous nature of the activity that was being depicted merited use of the handout image. But when it comes to the question that you started with, which was, how do you get uniformity around the use of handout imagery, as Mickey and I both saw a few years ago, exceedingly difficult, because you had, broadcasters and different sorts of outlets, and getting consensus among them in terms of best practices and, demands of access of the then Obama administration took a long time. And when we finally got some level of consensus after, a year and a half of endless meetings in lawyers' offices down here in Washington, then what happened? The best practices were released by the White House Correspondents Association when? July the 4th. Why? Because it was felt, that's a great day to celebrate independence of the media. What happened? It sank without trace. And by then we were into the sort of the election campaign. So it's complicated. I think the other thing that's curiously influencing all of this are the economics of journalism. Many news outlets are struggling with, the shift of advertising revenue from paper to online and its sort of dispersal online and all of that. And as a result, many media outlets are looking for subscribers in order to bolster their businesses. What they want to give the subscribers is what they think the subscribers want. So as a result, if the media was already on a spectrum, you had at one end you would have certain outlets on the left, on the other end you would have certain outlets on the right. Even previously neutral outlets find themselves in the position of making their news more appealing to who they think their readers are. So you get the insertion on the print side of adjectives and adverbs that some would say were not there before and some would say are not strictly speaking necessary. But the feeling in these outlets is, well, they have to be there to cater to the core of that outlet, whether it's Fox News or MSNBC or even the New York Times or even the Washington Post to some degree. And the same thing, I think, is also happening on the visual front. So curiously enough, or maybe it's not so curious, the economics of the media are also influencing how the stories are being told.
So, Sam, you talk to newsrooms a lot. What do you tell them?
What do I tell them?
What do you tell them about dealing with these kinds of issues?
What everyone said, for these handout images, I think it's very tough because you're caught in that catch-22 where you need to use the image because you have no other way, you have no other means, you were denied access to actually photographing yourself, so you need to use the image. But I also have concerns that as we put in the cut line, in this handout image obtained from the White House, that means something to people in this room. But I have the feeling the audience doesn't realize the idiosyncrasy of what that is, right? And they just see the picture, right? They don't actually understand that it's a handout imagery and what that means and how that can skew their understanding of it. But I think it's imperative that, I'm glad to hear that the Associated Press policy was things that we should be at, where we're going to refuse things we weren't at or don't expect to have access to, we'll take. But I worry about that slippery slope in the reduced access in tandem with things like the financial pressures of not having as many photographers covering these events as we used to, will that then empower some of these administrations to do even more increased handouts, right?
Can I just jump back to something
Sure.
that Santiago just said? I think it's a really important point because it goes to photo selection, where you've got two candidates, whether it's on television or in the newspaper, and they're in a box, and we're talking about them, and one of them is smiling and one of them is frowning, or one of them looks serious and the other one looks kind of sinister or joking. And I just kind of wondered if you could maybe just elaborate on that a little bit, because I think photo selection is a really big deal. I think that we're
Yeah, photo editing is as is video editing. It's a huge part of the conversation because photographers now are using cameras that they fire up to 13 frames a second or something. And when you watch photographers work, they're firing little mini bursts, and then they are going back and editing it. And often the editing is being done sort of on the scene by the photographer. And what you get sometimes is, depending on the situation, the photographer is obviously very passionate about their work, as they should be, but sometimes they're not clinical as they should be when it comes to the editing. And so what you will get is the sort of a bias. We all have biases. A bias will be amplified through the editing process. And so you start to get situations on occasion where if a newsmaker is, particularly expressive, or is particularly tired, or particularly sweaty, or whatever it might be, the photographer will choose to zero in on that. Now, that's not to say that what the photographer saw didn't happen. It often did, but it's the way that that information is presented. And so you really do often get editorializing in photography as a result of that. And then, of course, you typically get a second layer of editing at the headquarters of the organization that the photographer is working for before it goes out to the public. But in some cases, with automated feeds, what the photographer is doing is delivered immediately to the public. And then just if we could go to this image that was mentioned earlier. So this was an official image released by the White House the night of the Osama bin Laden raid. You see everybody there. It was deemed by most media outlets, a worthy use of an official image. Yet it wasn't just an official image, it was an official image that had been manipulated. When you look at the piece of paper in front of Hillary Clinton on the keyboard of her laptop, that was deemed by the White House to show something sensitive, and so it was pixelated. And you wouldn't know that looking at it here, and most people wouldn't know it, especially on a small screen or on any kind of screen, really. So we had the double thing at this time. Do we use the image? And the image is manipulated, and no, they're not going to give us a clean version of the image. So we had to say, in this image released by the White House, which, by the way, was manipulated at source, and you get to this inside baseball conversation that makes perfect sense to us in the media, but probably doesn't make a huge amount of sense to people, consuming the news, sort of ordinary news consumers.
So I always smile to myself when I do these panels, because what's going to happen here is I didn't know that Santi was going to talk about this image. I just happened to have it in there for this reason, talking about manipulation. Notice somebody missing from this picture? This is the Israeli press that doesn't necessarily believe women have a place at these type of high-level meetings. So, I kind of just had that in there for that, and that's what happens when you don't have an independent press, because if that was the only image that came out, let's just say it was the government that said, forget about the sensitive information in her lap. We don't think she has any place being there in an image, so she's gone, and that's all the public gets to see. So just kind of wanted to throw that out there. But really what you were talking about in the feed, and this, again, you guys didn't talk, but Bill gave me a whole bunch of images here, and I'm going to go back to them. And talking about feeds and selection of a moment, a decisive moment, as it were. Is it really a decisive moment, or is it more of an opinion? Go ahead.
Well, sure. This is the curious case of Jalen Brunson, who's was a basketball player in Illinois. And let me preface this by saying that Al Tompkins at the Poynter Institute actually did the analysis on this, did a fabulous job, and I'm pretty much giving him the credit for this. This is not my analysis, but he was a top number one of the top players in the high school, and he was in a semifinal basketball game in Illinois for the 4A championship in March of 2014. he put up a three-point shot, it went in, and the referee waved off the three-point shot because there had been a foul. And he turned towards the opposing team's audience, and this photograph was captured. And these photographs were also captured by a different photographer, and you can't see the detail in there. But what you would see is that there's 20 photographs, to your point, on a 3-second in a 3-second time frame. Now that photograph with his middle finger extended was published by one media outlet. That cut sheet on the next page is the Chicago Tribune, I think freelancer or perhaps their full-time photojournalist, who released his cut sheet, and they did not publish that photo of the middle finger extended because he looked at the cut sheet and saw 20 photographs taken in 3 seconds and saw that the finger was only extended in 3 of them. And that in the other 17 photographs, as he was moving his hands up and down, the finger was not extended. And he did not feel that that extension of the finger was actually the gesture that the basketball player was making towards the audience, that he was throwing his hands up in despair, but that he wasn't, offering that derogatory epithets towards the audience. So they didn't publish it, and this turned into a defining moment for this young man, because there was a discussion afterwards. Twitter exploded, as you might imagine, after the photo was published by one of the competing newspapers, and there was a discussion as to whether or not that player should be suspended for that third place championship game the next day. They decided not to suspend him. He went on Twitter and he said, I apologize if anybody, was offended, but I don't apologize for what I did because I didn't do what you're seeing in that photo. He went on to get a scholarship to one of the top universities, and I believe he won a national championship, and he's, be under consideration for the NBA in the next year or two. But it really hurt his career, and it was just that small, tiny moment in time that was captured, and it's like a blink of an eye. Was that blink somebody sleeping, or were they just blinking? Were they laughing or were they crying? Was that, were they wiping away a tear? Were they wiping away sweat? And I think that was really, an important lesson there in the case of Jalen Brunson.
So it's that seeing isn't necessarily believing at some point?
Well, I don't think anybody definitively ever concluded, but there was some video that came out later, and it was shot by somebody in the stands, and you saw him throw his hands up and down. And after you look at the video, it becomes more clear that he really wasn't. Maybe if he'd been thinking about it, maybe he pulled back, or maybe maybe his hands were just extended in a certain awkward position, but he really wasn't in a position where he was doing that.
So I'm going to see if I can get this to play. We'll start to talk about. So this is a shot out the window of a plane that's landing. And there's all this talk about drones these days, and possibly having problems with flying too close to airliners. And this video was up, and it was very popular, of this drone that had hit aircraft winglet, and then the winglet started to disintegrate. The only problem with that is that's all computer generated, and this was out there again as an example of, see, drones are dangerous, and I just want to kind of use that to kick off the discussion. Sam, I'm going to see if I can find some of the images you gave me. Do you want to talk about some of these?
Yeah, I mean, I had a lot of these examples been put out there. Again, I want to just reiterate, this is nothing new. We've seen this happen over the years, whether it be state-sponsored manipulations like handout images from North Korea or Russia. We've seen this in staff photographers who have, altered images in the field and haven't been caught till after the images were published. We've seen it a lot in user-generated stuff, where people are manipulating it, or in this case, actually on screen misrepresenting something. So this is something, I wanted to put something in here that was fairly recent. This is from the Manchester attack, where at the Ariana Grande concert, what we saw very shortly after first reports of the incident were actually on Instagram and on Twitter, photos of Ariana Grande injured. and people were passing these off as her actually injured from that event, right? In actuality, what they were, and you could easily deduce this if you just took these images and performed a simple reverse image search, whether it be in Google reverse image search or TinEye, you'll see that they actually correlate to a TV show called Scream Queens, which she did sometime before that. But we're seeing this more and more. We're seeing this where it's not necessarily always somebody taking a photo into Photoshop or making a video and altering it to make it not reality. We're seeing actual images being misrepresented to kind of fit a situation, right? And this is something that's just as disturbing. It's a little bit probably easier to combat because a lot of the times these images can be debunked fairly quickly. But with the speed of information that occurs across social media, it can become very troubling because many times media unwittingly amplify these messages when they see these things, right? And so, again, going back to what we first started talking about with this whole fake news, I really think that's a disservice. I think we should really start to help identify what we're seeing and what they really are, right? What was the intent behind it? Was the intent to deceive? Was it, here's some more examples, I guess, of things that have been where things were either removed or put in. The bottom photo I show a lot to newsrooms. This was actually a picture from MH17, which we all remember was an airliner that was shot down over the Ukraine. In that instance, across Twitter, what we saw were people who, in breaking news situations, were actually manipulating the bottom photo there on the left, bottom left, to write Malaysian Airlines on the hull. And put that picture out during that breaking news situation. What that actually turned out to be was a production still from the TV show Lost. That in that breaking news situation, people are out there manipulating these things, putting them across Twitter, and they're being amplified. That picture was within about the first 90 minutes, and it had over 3,000 retweets. And so that's the issue: is the speed of information, right? It happens so quickly and it's amplified so quickly across social that sometimes it even traps journalists in its wake, right? And so, I mean, what I like to see and what I hope we all can talk about a little bit as we move forward is the resources that people and the tools that are out there to help kind of debunk this, right? There's nothing that I know of that's out there that will tell you definitively whether it's true or whether it's fake. But there are workflows that can be done, generally speaking, in tandem with identifying the uploader or the purported creator, as well as things that can be done to the actual file or the image that you're looking at to kind of corroborate, does it seem right, does it seem to pass what we expect it to pass. But yeah, I mean, the idea that there are many different ways that this come about, again, things that are put forth and are very manipulated to things like misrepresentation. I think we see that a lot. We see that a lot in there's a picture up there of what people were passing around during Sandy, which actually was another production shot from a movie. But this is a great grid here of things that we've seen over time. A lot of these are very, very well known. Some of these are almost now 10 years old, I guess. And they run the gamut of things that have been manipulated by governments, user-generated content, and again, things that have been altered by staff or freelance photographers. So this is not something new. But I think this is much more of an issue now because of the prominence, the flood of imagery and the speed of information. And quite honestly, the reduced resource of newsrooms to be able to combat this.
Yeah, so this is one of those images that, again, Sam picked it out. I've been using it for a while just because NPPA, along with the White House news photographers, commented on it. This is, I believe, from 2013. Nancy Pelosi decided to have a gathering of the incoming women of Washington, and they posed for a photo on the steps of the Capitol. The problem was that there were 3 women that were running behind schedule, and so they later photoshopped them in. There's the original picture. And now we have some of the women that weren't there and that were added in. As I said, it's not a true and accurate depiction. If one of these women had just murdered her husband and said, I couldn't possibly have done it, I was on the steps of the Capitol at that time. These are the problems that we see if we didn't have another, it happened to be news photographer, that that was there and photographed the scene as it actually occurred. These were images that were pushed out by Nancy Pelosi's office with no, again, explainer to them. Hey, women were, late, and we added them in. As it turned out, they actually moved people around in this picture. As you can imagine, in a group shot, you can't always, people's heads are behind other people's heads, and they fixed one of the congresswoman's hair. So it's, where does it stop? And actually, their response to us was what was very cold that day, and the women were all very busy. And our suggestion back was, then why didn't you just Photoshop everybody in, and they could have all then gone about the business of Congress that day and not bothered to pose for a picture. So, Santi, I want to just come back to that, and I don't think we can stress enough the importance of truthfulness in images that people are looking at.
I think it's very important. So then when you if you can go back to the previous slide, before that, Mickey, the one that had all the examples, the grid, there. So there are some pictures here. The second picture from the left on the top row was shot by a photographer who was working for Reuters in Beirut during some fighting there, and he chose to add some smoke to the picture to make it look more realistic. The one on the second row, far left, that was shot by an AP freelancer in South America who chose to remove his shadow from the picture by cloning in some sand at the bottom of the picture. And then the one just to the right of the golfer, again on the second row, the fellow with the gun in his hand, the rifle in his hand, that's another AP freelance photographer in Syria who chose to remove a video camera that his colleague had left on the ground and that he felt distracted from the essence of the picture, so he photoshopped out the video camera. In all three of those cases, the photographers were caught within a very short time of having done this, either because of sloppy photoshopping or somebody denounced them, or in the case of the Syrian picture, the photographer came some weeks later and admitted that he'd done that.
Is that a firing offense?
Well, this is what I'm getting to. The question is, what should the consequences be? In all three of those examples, the consequences were quite drastic in the sense that the photographer lost their job or lost their association with the media outlet. Their photographs were removed in their entirety from the online archive of the media outlets, and effectively their careers were ruined. So in a case like that, you can say, and I was involved in two of those cases and made the determination that those photographers should never work, at least for the Associated Press again. But then the question comes up, that's a sort of life without parole type sentence, or in professional death sentence, if you like. Is that does the punishment fit the crime here? If you think about, in the case of the New York Times many years ago, Jason Blair, the writer who fabricated a lot of reports and invented scenes that he was never at, and he was caught doing that and fired from the New York Times, and you see his name pop up occasionally doing things.
He's a life coach now, just so you know.
Right, but so his
Seriously.
journalism career was terminated. It's not dissimilar to this. Is that the fitting punishment? You have been entrusted with a great responsibility of telling the public what's happening in the world. You have chosen to abuse that responsibility and deliberately mislead the public. Therefore, should you never ever work again as a journalist or a photographer, photojournalist for the rest of your life? Or what should the punishment be? I don't think that news organizations necessarily think that out longer term. They deal with the scene or the situation as it happens. They don't want that person working for them. That makes sense. But it's sort of an open question. What should happen to people who deliberately mislead?
Yeah, it's the same question that comes up in newsrooms around plagiarism, which, you might think, oh, any plagiarism ought to be a firing offense, and it isn't. And there are gradations of it, and a first offense that might be seen as, well, I pulled my notes over into this thing and it was unintentional and it'll never happen again. You don't necessarily fire that person. and I think this is a similar case. It's not always a death sentence, but it sure as heck has to be taken seriously.
Well, one thing I'll add is a lot of the times when some of these have been uncovered and they go back through the archives, they'll
Yeah.
actually find other instances.
You don't do it once.
I think it's rare to think that the first time somebody does this, you'll
the
catch
one
them.
they get
Yeah,
caught,
unless
yeah.
it's really poorly done. I will note too, and I believe I'm correct in saying the Reuters investigation actually uncovered, this is the top one with the smoke, actually uncovered a photo editor who was then summarily fired as well. There was some type of collusion going on with that. And that the Syrian one, if I'm correct, Santi, was part of a Pulitzer winning package, which conflates these things. The idea that
No, it wasn't part of a winning package. It was later. It was shot after the Syrian photography one.
okay, but I think it's almost in my mind, depending on if it's a freelancer or a staff photographer, malpractice, let's say, right? The idea that when you sign up that there are these rules and regulations, and what you're entrusted to do is go out and to follow them to some degree, right? That any breach of that, come what will, right? I mean, if you're fired from that organization, that's potentially what happens. And then, I mean, that's not to say that that some of these people, I don't know if that's the case, but could potentially be employed by another news organization sometime. I doubt that necessarily occurs in most cases, but I think, in many respects, it's a breach of trust for the audience, which actually has ripple effect for that organization. No, I was just going to say, because many people don't realize, that one picture that comes from the AP or from Reuters or whoever runs in multiple newspapers, and then when it's found out to be incorrect or false, even those newspapers that publish it have harm towards them, because the audience, again, doesn't discern, the AP or Reuters made the issue. They just say, the newspaper is publishing something that's not truthful.
I think that, your credibility is your number one asset as a journalist. I mean, clear. I mean, that's and when you think about the news organizations that you trust the most, it's probably because they are more likely to get it right. The Associated Press being one, for example, that we have relied upon, obviously, as an industry for a long, long time. And so, an error by a organization with a lower credibility or a lower reputation, doesn't have the ripple effect that it does when the Associated Press sends something out that's wrong, because it goes everywhere. And, I always try to impress upon, whenever we're talking with our recent college graduates who are coming into our smaller markets in our company, we have these sessions with them. We say, look, your credibility is your number one asset. And the more credible you become in this newsroom, the more eventually you're going to be moved into higher positions and your career is going to be strong. And when you start dabbling with photographs, when you start, short-circuiting the process, when you start playing around with, your use of your accuracy and your sources, your credibility is going to be damaged and you're going to suffer. And it's my hope as a profession that through all of this noise that's happening right now with photographs and manipulations and things being pushed around through social media, that eventually people are going to turn to certain news organizations that they will trust and say, what have you discovered? What have you found? Is this true? We've got all these online checking organizations that look to try to fact check things. But even some of those organizations are called under fire for having an agenda sometimes, or for not always giving all. And so I think the higher you can get your credibility, your track record, the stronger you're going to be as an organization. And that's where I think speed kills, because it's better to be right and be second than it is to be first and be wrong. And we see this over and over again. We saw this when the Affordable Care Act Supreme Court decision was announced, and there were two cable channels that went on the air and gave the exact opposite ruling from what the court had just decided. Now, they flipped it around in a few minutes, but that was a big mistake that I think, drew their credibility into question. And these were, major multi-billion-dollar organizations who got it wrong because they were trying to be first. So I think part of our solution long-term is going to be getting it right, even if we get it right a few hours later. I've been very, and forgive me for this long answer, but I've been very impressed by some of the journalists who've written stories about our company, because they will contact us and they'll ask a series of questions and they'll ruminate on it and they'll germinate on it and they'll think about it and they'll come back with a few more questions and they'll ask for a little bit more information, and then they'll go away for a week or two and they'll come back and they might publish something a week or two later. They're not necessarily interested in being first, they're interested in getting the story correct. And I have a lot of respect for those people, even if they're writing things about us that I'm not always fond of. I'm very, I'm respectful of them because they took the time to get it right, and they have a very high, standard of credibility with me at least. So, sorry for the tangent.
No,
Barry.
no, it's fine. So we'll have some controversial pictures today. So it's interesting. If you all remember, on Inauguration Day, there was a video clip that was run side by side of when the Obamas came into office and what happened going up to the White House with the Bushes, that the president waited for Mrs. Obama and then followed her up versus the video of Donald Trump walking ahead and leaving Melania behind kind of to figure out where she should be. And I had commented about that on Facebook. And then somebody said, yeah, oh yeah, well, if he's such a good guy and that video was shot from the front, what about this picture? Which was obviously shot from behind. And yeah, like, well, what about it? Except for the fact that that's the real picture that was shot from behind. This is the photoshopped picture of kind of reinforcing. Bill, you remind me of like people going to their trusted sources. The problem is these days, who can you trust? And are just people in this echo chamber of seeing and believing what they want to see and believe. Sam, I mean, other than sourcing, doing some research online, because there's a lot of people out there with way too much time on their hands that will do these kinds of things, either in the manipulation or in discovering the manipulation. I'd love to have people go away with some positive things that they can do in terms of, getting to the source of these images that are false.
I mean, can you actually go back to that first image you showed about the tornado that with a guy
Sure.
mowing the lawn? So this is another really, really recent image that I'm sure when it first came out, I mean, when I saw it, it was actually through news reports, but when it first came out, it was probably pretty questionable, just because it's such a juxtaposition of nonchalant cutting the grass with what seems to be something pretty dangerous not too far away. Obviously, there's some compression going on with the photograph, but I mean, this is a great example of an image that comes across, and let's say the news outlet wants to potentially use this. There are lots of things that can be done with this image as an example to potentially correlate that this is something that's potentially real. Obviously, if there's a tornado of that magnitude, you're probably going to have other reports going on, right? So that's kind of your bare basics. Make sure that there's other kind of corroborating imagery that's going on. But with this image specifically, again, I go back to that kind of two-line of questioning, right? Who's this uploader? Who is this? And I think in this image, if I'm correct, it was the wife of the person mowing the lawn. Obviously, this was put out there on social first, I think. So it would be, can we get a hold of her? Can we actually start asking her questions about when was this? Why'd you take this image? What kind of camera did you take this picture with? Can we get the original picture, right? And the original picture is so necessary because if you can get an unmolested or an unedited image from the original source, there's a lot more that you can do technically to help verify that image. Likely speaking, if this was from a smartphone, which I'm guessing it was, it'll usually have embedded metadata that you can then corroborate to a camera make and model, a device. There's going to be aperture settings. There's going to be all these other information that's embedded into that file, which you can then help corroborate when you start talking to her. On a secondary line of verification, it's taken outdoors, which is great, right? Because you can actually, using products, this was in Canada, I think, right? Using products, freely available products like Google Street View, Google Earth Pro, you can start to correlate where this image was purportedly taken and see if there is a tree in that backyard and a bush in that backyard, and that backyard backs up to an open grassy area like that, which then again correlates potentially where you're seeing other imagery. So there's a lot you can do from the actual file or the container of the file, and there's a lot you can potentially do if you can get your hands on the person. And correlating those two, I think, is where the best verification occurs. Obviously, all that stuff takes time. It takes resource. And so, hopefully news organizations have someone dedicated with these skills that can do that. I know that's not always the case, and that's where we kind of run into that kind of catch-22. But generally speaking, I was at a newsroom very recently talking about some social media images that came across from the Teterboro crash, which was the plane crash that happened a couple weeks ago outside of New York City. And we did the same thing. We looked at some of the first reports of images that came through, and actually from a handful of those, we're able to correlate by signage and by locations of things where we're in a very small area where the crash actually occurred. And that was without having talked to anybody. Just by looking at 5 to 10 different images and comparing them, we could kind of co-locate where the plane likely went down, which in this case was where it went down. But again, teaching these kind of tools, I think will help raise that literacy on the journalist side to be able to do some of this legwork even before you get to talk to the original creator, right? But talking to them and correlating that is the best way to go, but there's lots of things you can do just by the look of the image.
So I'm going to want to get to some of the audience questions, but that really segues into what I'd like to talk about before we get to that, which is it's great if there are tools, but then we need bodies. We need, when we're seeing news organizations, the AP certainly concerned about its credibility, addressed the issues when photographers manipulated images. But what about what we're seeing in terms of the wholesale gutting of photo staffs, including the photographers and the editors? And right now it's, in some places, it's the reporters shoot pictures on iPhones or pictures come in from social media and there is no vetting process and they just get put up. What kind of responsibility do we as the media have while we're bemoaning the fact that we don't have access and things in terms of, getting our own house in order?
So I remember a moment, and I guess it was a couple of years ago now, when the Chicago Sun-Times laid off its entire photo staff, and the thinking was sort of, well, as you said, we're going to send our reporters out with iPhones, and there's a lot of user-generated images out there, and there is a devaluing of the role of photojournalists as journalists. And I think that anything we can do to combat that internally in newsrooms is going to help. They, as we know, photojournalists are true journalists and not just guys with cameras.
Bill, can you talk about, how your organization is addressing this problem? Because obviously economics play an important part, and you have to stay in business to have anybody have a job, and yet where did decisions get made like that?
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I'll take it over to the legal side for just a second at the risk of boring people. But, we have got a 5-part test to get a photograph on the air if we didn't generate it. And it kind of goes down to a lot of the legal side of it, which is that the first thing is the photograph has to be the story. You just can't pull some stock photo unless we have the rights to it and use it. And so if we're taking a picture off of Wikipedia, obviously, we're not going to do that because we don't have the rights to the photo. But the second thing is that we have to put the photograph in a position where we're using it in a transformative way. And in order to do that, we have to start having a discussion about how we're actually reporting on this photograph. This is, again, for the legal copyright usage. Then we have to show the photograph in context of where it's being displayed online, whether it's on a Facebook page or on a Twitter feed. And then we have to, the fourth thing is we have to use it in a limited fashion, and the fifth thing is we have to have a manager sign off on it. Those are processes that our journalists have to go through to get a photograph to air. And so, while again, that doesn't necessarily solve the fake photo situation, it puts the photographer or the reporter or the producer or the manager in a position at 3 o'clock in the morning when they may be the only person in the newsroom and they get user-generated content to say, well, I've got to get to step 5, and that means I got to call a manager, which means that they're going to have a discussion. So yeah, the staffs may not be as large as they used to, but we're trying to equip our people with different, tools, as we would say, the electronic tools, but then also the standard tools to get a photograph on the air. It's not foolproof, and that's the scary part. It lowers the propensity for error, but it doesn't solve it entirely.
So Santiago, you've been doing this for a long time. Where do you see things going? I mean, do you think that some news organizations get the fact that they really do need staff, at least as it pertains to photographs?
Well, it's interesting at the AP, which is obviously a news wholesaler providing news to tens of thousands of news outlets around the world. Many of those news outlets rely on organizations like the AP or Reuters or AFP to get their news. And when it comes to verification of user-generated content, this stuff pops up quickly. It's out there on Twitter or Facebook or wherever it might be. The news organizations will then call an organization like the AP and saying, how come you haven't distributed this yet? And the AP will say, well, we're still doing the sorts of things that Bill mentioned, the verification and all of those sorts of things. That takes time. And sometimes the news organizations get very frustrated and they say, well, it's been 2 hours. Why don't you have this nailed down yet? Well, because the picture emanated someplace hard to find or difficult to get to or whatever it might be. And then so the response you would think would be, well, if you're so keen to run it, run it. And they say, well, we don't want to have any legal jeopardy here. So it's sort of you're in a catch-22. And then the onus on the wholesalers is much higher because the legal exposure is potentially much more severe because we're providing it to tens of thousands of customers. If it's one customer who wants to take a risk and use a fair use argument or just go ahead and take it, then that's the risk that they face relevant to their size and their scale. If an organization like the AP doesn't tick all the boxes, then the legal risk is potentially much higher. But really, where is all this headed? I heard somebody the other day, a self-described futurist, media sort of futurist, talking about the future of the media and how people are going to interact with the media, say that as far as she was concerned, the internet is self-correcting and that these errors are not that important. Now, I don't personally share that view. I think there is an historical record. I think it's important to have credibility. I think it's important to do all of these things. But I worry sometimes that the notion that the internet is self-correcting based on the premise that this flow is so fast that, who's going to remember what happened 6 months ago or a year ago, given the deluge of information that's being put out there. I worry that that sort of attitude is going to become more prevalent and that gradually over time the notion of journalistic standards is going to be diminished somehow to the point where it's just not going to be important anymore, and it's going to be a messy, mucky free-for-all, and the people with the resources to wade through it will get the quality information, and everybody else will be left with the scraps, and they won't know how to make sense of it. That's what worries me. So again, what to do about that? I think education is key. But, education at the earliest opportunity to educate people, starting with children and moving on up through young adults, to realize that sourcing information is so important. In the same way that if you hear a rumor at the water cooler, you're going to ask, well, who said that? Where did that come from? You'll determine whether you think it's credible or not. But unless we are consistently questioning where information is coming from and how it's getting to us and understanding the mechanics involved, I fear that the terrain is right for all sorts of misinformation and manipulation. And as we've seen already, there are many actors, whether they're state or military or political actors, who are quite keen to control the message and manipulate the message towards their own ends. And that's obviously where an independent press comes in. But unless it's a well-informed independent press and the readership of the independent press is also well-informed, I think it's going to be a very precarious time going forward.
So I saw some people raise their hands, so take some, hang on a second. Somebody's got a microphone, I think, so we can get the questions on tape. They want it for the recording.
Yeah, hi, I'm the photo editor for the Baltimore City paper. We're owned by the Tribune. I refuse to say trunk, so we're owned by the Tribune. There's a little bit of hypocrisy going on with this panel. And I have a lot of young photographers. And doesn't this start at the top? I mean, like, World Press doubled down on that the Belgian photographer who his locations weren't exactly real, but it was like, well, it's okay, that's just malleable. And like Sinclair, I mean, you guys manipulated that Freddie Gray tape to say, so kill a cop, right? And I mean, you sit up here and you're talking to young photographers saying, well, we've got to do this, we've got to do this. But doesn't it start with you guys? I mean, doesn't it really starting with, I mean, how many people got fired, Bill, from Fox? One, I'll tell you, the reporter. The producer didn't get fired. Nobody at Sinclair lost their jobs. Same thing with the World Press is kind of self-policing now. Like, I think after they've changed their guidelines and kind of opened it up. But I mean, still, if I have an intern that looks at World Press and says, well, this guy, these really aren't the same locations, right? Am I, you know what I'm talking about, Santi, the Belgian photographer, and World Press kind of doubled down on it. And they were just like, well, okay, it might not be the locations he said they were in the thing, but that's not true, you know, Bill. And the same with Fox. I mean, I was on a panel with Kai Jackson at Loyola College. How do you tell these students? You're up there saying, well, people got to do this, and then we can't manipulate. But it's guilty from the top. And how many images did Fox News run during the Obama administration that just weren't real? Like those Sarah Palin rallies, right? The Daily Show called this out all the time. Right. So shouldn't there be more dialogue from you guys at the top to the photographer from the bottom instead of putting the onus on, like, well, the photographers have to do this, this, and this? When you guys calling the shots, turn a blind eye. I mean, I've shot every RNC, DNC. I've never gotten this like vetting thing. All I get is from ABC, Fox, NBC. Can we use this photo across all platforms? Blah blah blah, et cetera, et cetera. No one's been vetting my Instagram. Like they ask for that and they don't pay for it, right? So isn't this a top-down problem and not a bottom-up problem?
I think it's both. I don't think it's an either-or situation. I think it's a both-and situation. I think organizations make mistakes because people make mistakes, and whether they make them deliberately or whether they make them, through error, through human error, I think the onus needs to be on the organizations, throughout the organizations, to have these instances of fakery or misleading photography or whatever this particular case is, have those become, occur as infrequently as possible. You cite the World Press photo example of these pictures from Belgium. For those not familiar with it, this was a series of photographs taken by a Belgian photographer purporting to show a particular town in a sort of a negative light. And in doing so, he included some pictures that were not shot in the town at all. World Press Photo conducted their own internal investigation, but they didn't do a particularly good job of it. And another photographer did a deeper investigation and found out that these images were included in a winning package and shouldn't have been. And when that came to light, World Press Photo disqualified the photographer and tried to correct the mistake. What they learned from that as an organization is that when you have instances of cheating, it's better to bring in an outside independent investigator to take a look at it. And there was a case earlier this year where there were some allegations around another prize-winning series of pictures that from Iran that somebody claimed had been set up or staged or were not truthful, and they hired an independent investigator to look at that. That happened to be me before I started working for World Press Photo, and I conducted an exhaustive investigation into the circumstances, presented some evidence to the jury, who then made a determination. And the issue was resolved, not to everybody's satisfaction, but it was a good faith effort. But I think more broadly, these issues of journalistic standards are incredibly important, and they need to be taken incredibly seriously. And I would like to think that all media organizations take them collectively as seriously as possible. However, for reasons that we touched on before, whether it's economic pressure or lack of staffing or basic human error, that doesn't always happen. And sometimes the organizations take full responsibility for that, and sometimes they let it slide. And, it's a broad umbrella. The journalism is obviously, a broad umbrella that encompasses many different kinds of organizations and many different kinds of individuals with many different levels of experience and training and things of that nature. So aspirationally, it would be great that none of this stuff existed and that everything we saw online was true and accurate and fair. Sadly, that's not the case, and I don't think that's ever been the case in journalism because, depending on where journalism is practiced, it's heavily politicized, or it's skewed for economic reasons, or it's part of the political narrative, or whatever the case might be. So I think it's a very complicated issue, but I do take your point that the people at the top of organizations do need to be vigorous and rigorous about implementing standards, and I would argue that that needs to extend down throughout the organization so that everybody is responsible for their actions. And, you know, that happens to different degrees in different places.
What about the Freddie
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I would argue that photographers are at the bottom. I would argue against that. I know that you were using a top-bottom analogy there, but as a former photojournalist, I never have thought of and our vice president of news is a former photojournalist, and we put a lot of stock in our photojournalists. We're very proud of the awards that they win. That was a mistake, and we were called out on it, and it was an error in judgment. And the next day at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I believe we spent almost a half an hour discussing the mistake. This was not something that was hidden away. There was an error on our error. And the next day, the anchors were on the set. I think they were interviewing the woman who had been mischaracterized. Her words had been mischaracterized. She was sitting on the set. They were talking with her. There were employee reprimands, as you pointed out. So there wasn't any hiding about that. But I would also let me just add one thing. I am speaking in broad platitudes, no question. And with an organization where we have 4,000 journalists producing content in 66 different cities every single day, more than 2,000 hours of news every single week, there are going to be mistakes. And we have to own them, which I think we did. And we have to be very, very careful going forward, and we have to use those as examples to continue to raise our standards. But we're not perfect, and if I ever gave the impression that we are, that wasn't my intention.
But to call it a mistake, though, is kind of, I mean,
Sure.
They took dialogue from a video. Basically, the video was the protesters in Baltimore were saying killer cops belong in cell blocks. The local Fox affiliate, someone there made a decision, and like you just said, it goes through all of these vetting process, right? So there's this chain. It's not, oh, we put that photo on there. That's not right. They took the video and made this woman say, "So kill a cop," and
I don't think we made her say that. I think
No,
that what
you-
happened
it was
was,
edited and
yes,
put
well,
together, right?
there was a YouTube video that had surfaced, and just to kind of close, I don't want to, but I think that there was a YouTube video that was up, and it was kind of gaining traction, and that's what somebody thought she said, and the vetting process wasn't close enough on that, I don't believe, to definitively say that that's what she was saying. And I think if they had vetted it more closely, they would have realized that they were not taking that in context. I don't think they edited it to make her say something that she didn't say. I think they misinterpreted what she was actually saying because there was a lot of noise in the protest. And they
we covered
reported,
it was
right,
changed.
and they reported what she said incorrectly and then had to own it the next day. So, but you raise a fair point. I mean, it's not, there's, so.
So we're getting to be just about out of time, and I'd actually like to end on a positive note rather than doom and gloom. So I'll just go down the line. I'll start with Sam. So, where do we go from here, and what kind of takeaway can some of the folks here and that'll be watching have from the best things to do dealing with this?
Sure. So, what I tend to tell people is that there's no quick fix. I don't have a tool that I can tell you to use that's going to tell you 100% all the time, black and white. But I like to think that it's a combination of tools, training, and time that's going to help us solve this problem. As we continue to use tools we have today and develop new tools that will. I was talking to someone before we started this panel about how there's some talk about how in Apple's new OS, they're going to actually move away from the JPEG standard potentially and use a new file format standard, which will displace a lot of the work that I know of to be happening in verification, which is based upon a lot of JPEG compression standards. And so if that is the case, it's gonna change how we do things. Training is basically an offshoot of what we're doing today. The idea that we're trying to let people know about what's out there and how they can potentially make workflows to button up their process when they try to verify pictures or use user-generated content. And the idea that, again, it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's gonna be having discussions like this where we bring up the good, the bad, the ugly that's happening out there in ways that people have combated them to hopefully, to get closer to ending this kind of cat and mouse of manipulations and verification. So tools, training, time. That's what I like to tell people.
The 3 T's. I would say check the source. Always check the source. Regardless of what media you are consuming, check the source. Compare and contrast. If it's too good to be true, it's probably not true. Go look at things. Go to the media outlets that you believe in, that you trust, and see what they're saying about it. Take some time. I think speed is it's wonderful that we get news so fast nowadays, but it can also be hazardous in the sense that people are racing to get the news out first, and they're not necessarily being careful, and that amplifies the errors that people make, either deliberately or by accident or whatever the case may be. So I think it's really important to check the source, and I think everybody should always check the source when they're reading what's purported to be nonfiction. That's, I think, from my perspective, what I would say.
So,
I would just say speed kills. Most errors that we find whenever we're in a troubled situation where we realize we've made an error, it usually goes back to we went too fast, we didn't check, we might have come in with a narrative that wasn't true, we didn't run it through enough vetting processes, and then we made an error. So I think speed kills, and I think your credibility is your number one asset, and if we maintain that, we're going to really elevate ourselves as a profession and separate ourselves from the noise on the internet.
Margaret?
Well, I think media literacy is extremely important, and we have to, as news organizations and journalists, do whatever we can do to help the public understand what reading and consuming news critically means. And from my point of view, if there isn't a demand and an understanding of this on the public's part, we can have all the standards and do everything we can, but it won't really make a difference unless the public is attuned to this and is on our side in some way. So I think media literacy projects, which are, and this is a hopeful thing, getting more funding now in these recent months, and news organizations need to get with that program.
So I've just put another recent picture up there from the last hearing to show that really meaningful visual journalism still can be told by great visual journalists, and there are lots of photographers there, but you can still have that one image that really tells the story. And with that, I just want to thank my panelists and thank all of you for being here, and hopefully it was a good discussion.